Welcome. We're very privileged to have the opportunity to hear from our guest today, and I want to do his introduction justice, and that means I want to be cognizant of who we are in the room and the things we may already know and the things that some of us may not already know. So I'm going to give him the privilege of finishing his lunch while I set the table a little bit. Before I do, I think we will all have noticed already that we have some other guests with us today, special guests, and I want to welcome Sean and Elise. Sean is a colleague of ours in the field. He works at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, about which you will hear more shortly. But you didn't mention to me that you were a Ralph Goldman Fellow. That puts you in a different class altogether, and Ralph was a dear friend and has links with our university in the Negev as well. So we're very happy that you're here, both of you. They're getting married in a few weeks as well. So, and Ron Meyer, who is a very dear friend and a longtime colleague, and is my counterpart at the American Society of Yad Vashem, which is Israel's National Holocaust Memorial and Museum, and so we're very happy to have Ron here as well, so welcome. I was first introduced to Ted Comet when I was working in my last job, where I was part of the National Jewish Federation system, whose function it is to support Jewish communal life here in the United States and Jews in need wherever they are around the world. And my portfolio, my responsibilities had to do with the around the world part. And so I was introduced to Ted at a meeting of the World Council of Jewish Communal Service, which is the international body for people who work in the field of Jewish community and Jewish communal life, or Jewish and Israel communal life. Ted was a major figure in that organization, and I was introduced to him, and he invited me to come to a conference that was going on at the time in Jerusalem, and I got the sense that Ted Comet was a guy to be reckoned with. He'd been in the field for a while. He seemed to know everybody,
but everybody can get false impressions.
I left feeling this is a guy I should find out a little bit more about. Time passed, and I came into contact with him from time to time, both in that context and also in his work at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a position that he came to at a time in his life that lots of other people are already thinking about winding down in terms of their professional pursuits. But he arrived at a chapter that began, and now going back about 25 years or so, if I understood the timeline properly, and has continued to be an active part of the work that we do from here in the United States on behalf of the Jewish world and on behalf of the State of Israel. I want to say a couple of things about placing what we do and where we are into the context of recent history. I think that people can't always tell when they're living through historic events. I think we always know when we learn about events that happened in the past and they turned out to have been historic. And I think for a lot of people who've worked in anything related to the Jewish world or with the State of Israel, we know that not so very long ago was some of the most significant events in the history of our people and our community, whether it was the horrific Holocaust that took place during the Second World War, or the birth of the modern State of Israel, which happened only a few short years afterwards, and the things that happened to the people in both contexts, and what happened after that. And if you take forward the years that followed, the momentous events that happened as Israel went from being barely able to come into being at the time that it did, to surviving series of wars and confrontations with its neighbors. If you were involved in the Jewish world in that intervening period, you were introduced to the story of what we called Soviet Jewry, the Jews who had been sealed away behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet regime. Basically, from the end of the First World War until roughly 1989, 1990, and the movement grew up to help the world become aware that these were prisoners of conscience, people who were being sealed away because of their faith and their identity, and the work the Jewish world did and the broader world did to bring their story to light and then help them to find their way to freedom, which they did after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Many of us know the story of the modern exodus of the Ethiopian Jews who had been discovered, if you will, maybe 100 years or so ago, having been found that there was a community of black African Jews who had been in Ethiopia practicing Judaism for 3,000 years, brought to the attention of the world, and then in not too distant a period, the Jewish world played a part in helping them to fulfill their years of longing to come to the modern state of Israel and to join the continuing story of the Jewish people there, and so on and so on and so on. We come to realize that we have in recent years, in recent decades, lived through an extraordinary amount of history. And I think one of the remarkable things about this period and about that history is the fact that what I would call the organized Jewish community has played an instrumental part. The architecture of Jewish life around the world, and particularly now here in the United States, and the work that it organizes itself to do in creating enterprises like ours, the American Associates of BGU, to work on supporting aspects of it, or to work on being ready to engage challenges and issues when they arrive, or to deploy ourselves, our energy, our time, our resources when the need is greatest. Organizations like the Joint, which has been described over the years as the ambulance of the Jewish world. If there's a crisis or a problem anywhere on the planet that relates to our community, they're there to do whatever is necessary to be done. I don't want to embarrass him. Sean spent a year in Ethiopia working on relief with the remaining members of the Ethiopian Jewish community who are still working their way towards arriving in Israel. I describe all of this so that those of you who don't have a lot of extensive interaction with this field beyond the work that we do, which is meaningful in its own right, should understand that this work is carried out by legions of devoted professionals like the people in this room, who were drawn to it for cause, or who were drawn to it for a good professional opportunity, or who were drawn to it for whatever reason, and came to be part of something significant, more significant than a paycheck and the work that they generate. And then I come back to our guest today. When Ted and I first talked about his coming to be our guest and to spend some time with us, we talked about having the rare opportunity to hear from somebody who could reflect on 70 years of work in this field, 7 decades of work in our broader field. But it's not so much the duration of...
I feel like an antique already.
It's not so much the duration of the work as the places in which he has carried it out. While I could, I think, do all of this from memory, I want to make sure I don't miss any of the important pieces that I just think you should know before I introduce Ted and the topic that he's going to speak about today. After the Second World War, there was a horrific need on the part of the remnants, the survivors of the concentration camps, the remaining Jews of Europe. And as a student, Ted chose to volunteer with the Joint Distribution Committee to go to Europe to work with orphaned children. And that began a period. He was in Europe, I believe, for 2 years after the war, under circumstances that I will leave him to describe. Working to help bring those young people back to life after the horrors that they had lived through. Along the course of his career, in addition to what he did with the World Council of Jewish Communal Service, which I described to you briefly, Ted had stints with the national organization that oversaw the Jewish Federation system, the Jewish communal organizations of the field, where I also spent some time. He spent a decade formally working on programs that help bring American Jewish young people to Israel, on various informal educational programs and Israel experiences. He was the founder of what we now refer to as the Salute to Israel Day Parade in 1965 in New York. He was the organizer of the first events that became Solidarity Sunday and our major New York efforts to draw attention to the plight of Soviet Jewry, and that became an annual pilgrimage for many of us at the Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza at the United Nations headquarters here in New York. He led the first mission of Federation leaders to the Soviet Union to formally call attention to bringing the plight of the Jews of conscience to the attention of the world. He spent 25 years with the Joint, late in his career, a function that he continues to carry out. And he has been not just a witness to some of the great history of the modern era, but an active participant in making some of that history. I'll tell you that Ted is a native Clevelander, for those for whom that would be a meaningful bit of information, and a social worker by training who graduated from Yeshiva University in New York. It is in the context of one of the people that he met on his trip to Europe to help work with the surviving orphans of the Holocaust that we come to the subject of matter today. The world was shaken, I believe, by the recent loss of Elie Wiesel, who became part of the conscience of the Jewish people as a witness to what he survived in the Second World War. Our responsibilities to carry on very important aspects of who he was and what it was all about is a very significant matter for us to consider. We have the tremendous good fortune to have with us a guest who not just was acquainted with Elie Wiesel, but who shared a lifetime with him as a close and trusted and valued friend. And so it is with that, by way of extensive introduction, and with apologies to those who know lots about what I told you already, but I felt it was important for those who might not to hear it. It is my great privilege to introduce my friend and mentor, Ted Comet.
How do you follow an introduction like that? I think it's best to thank you and go home. Remind a little bit of, talk about experiences. At Yeshiva University, I had a professor of Talmud whose thoughts were always preoccupied with the higher realm of Talmudic study, and he didn't take any interest in such things as taking attendance. He used to assign that to various students in the class, with the consequence that he didn't know the names of the students. So one day he took out his large Talmud and he opened it up and he took out his scroll book, and purely a chance he opened up the attendance book and he said, "Slakowski, recite the lesson." Slakowski was sitting right under the rabbi's nose, and while a good student, he happened to be that day unprepared, and knowing the rabbi's exacting standards, he was afraid to bluff it through. So he sat there silent, petrified. The rabbi repeated, "Slakowski, recite the lesson." And then realizing that the rabbi didn't know who he was, he blurts out, "Rabbi, Slakowski is not here today." So the rabbi stroked his beard and said, "Well, in that case, then you recite the lesson." So what's the lesson I want to... So I'm calling this Reflections and Experiences from 70 Years of Friendship. Now, you recall that in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony opens his famous oration with the following words: "I come here to bury Caesar, not to praise him." And I want to point out, I'm here today not to mourn the passing of Elie Wiesel, but rather to praise his remarkable life and achievements. At a time when we lack heroic models, we have before us a man who did not permit the experience in hell to leave him embittered, cynical, disengaged, or immobilized. On the contrary, he found the profound secret of life. The secret of life, how to transmute trauma into creative energy and action. He learned that to assuage one's own pain, you can achieve by assuaging the pain of others, and to heal yourself by healing others. I don't know if you can get a more profound insight about how to live a life. There's a common saying that ein navi be'iro, that no one is regarded as a prophet in their town or in their time. So the question is, how was it possible for this teenage graduate of Auschwitz who came to America without position, without finances, without connections, without a power base, how did he become a universally admired prophet in his own time? With obituaries from President Obama and leaders from around the world. How did that happen? And what did he do to make that happen? Now, when I used to ask him, Elie, what do you really do? He would smilingly say to me, I'm a Maggid. I'm just a teller of tales. So in consonance with that response, I want to share a few stories that provide some insight into the meaning and makeup of this extraordinary man. Now, there's so much been written about him, so that I'm only going to draw upon my own personal experiences with him, because this is not part of public knowledge. My first story is in 1946, before departing for France. Just understand that there was, Robert Gamzon was a Frenchman who was head of the Jewish section of the French underground, which was called the Maquis. And he came to America and said that France had brought in, once and only time, 800 child survivors from Auschwitz, and that they had set up camps for them and other orphans that had survived in other contexts throughout France, and they needed madrichim, counselors, to live with them and to mentor them and to provide a sense of family that they had all lost. And just before I left, a friend of mine said, I have a cousin living in Versailles, would you look him up? I said, I have no idea where I'm going to be assigned, but I put the name and address in my wallet and I forgot about it. Of course, I come to France. Where do they send me? To the children's home in Versailles. So I came there late at night, it was raining, I didn't see the address, I just met the director, went to bed. Next morning I had breakfast with the group, they were older teenagers. Across from me was this teenager between my broken French, Hebrew, Yiddish, we got a conversation going, I was very impressed with the kid. And I went out for a walk, I walked a few blocks and I said, wait a minute, I don't have an assignment yet, now's a good time to get in a visit with the cousin. I take out the piece of paper, the address said 63 Avenue de Paris. I look up, the street I'm walking on is Avenue de Paris. I said, I can't believe this. I retraced myself, 63 is the address of the children's home. No, I'm totally flummoxed. I came in and I went up to the only person I knew besides the director was this kid I had breakfast with. And I said, tell me, is there anybody here by the name of Elie Wiesel? And the kid looks up at me and he said, c'est moi. Well, that c'est moi, over time, has evolved from a personal response to me to one of biblical proportions. When God asked Abraham, where are you? And Abraham answers, Hineni, I am here. We're not talking about where he is physically. God knows where he is. The question is, where are you spiritually? And when Abraham says Hineni, he means that he's ready to be a messenger for a higher calling. And so too has Elie's primary role been that of a messenger. And it's no coincidence that one of his books is entitled Messengers of God. Which leads to the question, what is the specific substance of his message? So in response, the second story I want to tell you took place in 1970 at the General Assembly of the Council of Jewish Federations. This was his first appearance before Federation leaders, and it was a night to remember. The part that stands out for me, more than 4 decades later, was this statement. How were we able to survive? More than that, why would we even want to survive during those hellish conditions? We felt that we had an obligation to survive in order to tell the story, because we felt if you knew, you would act. And if we had known then what we know now, that you knew and did not act, we would not have been able to survive. So Elie's primary message is Zachor, sustaining the memory of the Holocaust. But that's not enough. What we needed is Zachor gets transmuted into moral action. And this was illustrated in his confrontation with 3 American presidents. Not one, not 2, but 3 presidents. First with Jimmy Carter, who wanted the Holocaust Museum to memorialize everybody who was killed under Nazi regimes. And he argued that everybody who suffered should be merited to be remembered. But the Jews had a different kind of a destruction. None of the others had the destruction of a people. And this is unique. And he won that battle. The Holocaust Museum, as you know, basically deals with the Holocaust, but there is a section that deals with the non-Jews who also suffered under Nazism. The second one was with President Ronald Reagan. When German Chancellor Helmut Kohl wanted Germany to become part of the West, he invited President Reagan to come there. And when it became known that as part of the visit, he was going to put a wreath of memory at the Bitburg Cemetery. And when it came out that Nazi soldiers were buried at Bitburg, all hell broke loose. And at that time, Elie was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. And there was a big public event, which was public announced and filmed, etc. And Elie gets up there and he turns to President Reagan and he says, "The Talmud teaches us that we have to confront power with the truth. And the truth is that your place is with the victims and not with the perpetrators." Well, I mean, this took something going, right? The result was Bitburg, he didn't want to cancel, they spent 10 minutes at Bitburg, and he added a visit to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which had not been originally under Germany. And the third one was with Clinton. And after a visit to Bosnia, he reported on the bloodshed and the need to take action. And his pressure helped the eventuation of what is known as the Dayton Peace Accord. And in the Jewish field, Elie played a vital role in the struggle to free Soviet Jewry. In 1996, he went to the Soviet Union, and upon his return wrote a book called Jews of Silence, and told me very clearly, Jews of Silence is not a description of the Jews in the Soviet Union, it's a description of American Jewry for not taking action on behalf of the Jews in the Soviet Union.
66.
1966, yeah, thank you. And for those of us involved in the movement to free Soviet Jewry, his book was a breakthrough, projecting the issue onto the larger public arena, and his subsequent efforts helped to achieve the greatest political victory of American Jewry. How's that? When President Reagan met with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, there were just 4 items on President Reagan's agenda, and one of them was Soviet Jewry. I mean, imagine those 4 items, and this was one of the 4. And I want to move now onto his status as an icon. On a spiritual level, he radiated life and inspired faith, and he taught us how to mourn this Holocaust, how to remember, and how to act. And on a literary level, we knew he possessed the power of words, such as, to forget is to become an accomplice. Remembering is a religious action. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. I repeat, the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. To suffer gives no privileges. If used against others, it is betrayal. If used to fight evil, it elevates. And on a personal level, he loved interacting with students as well as world leaders, challenging and inspiring. He made Judaism become alive. And with all his seriousness, he had a great sense of humor and loved a good joke. And on a larger scale, Elie's a symbol of the persistence of the Jewish people. When we were celebrating the bris of his son, my wife, who's also a survivor, remarked, "Coming from a death camp to creating life, for me is a sign that the Jewish people will never go under." And as a humorous aside, when we were dancing, I was next to the famous violinist Isaac Stern. And jokingly, I turned to him and I said, "Are you the moil here?" And he said, "No," he says, "I perform on a different instrument." My final question was, what was Elie's most powerful form of expression? And given the impact of his lectures and his books, you'll be surprised to know that in my view, his most powerful expressiveness was through his singing. Through his singing. At the 92nd Street Y, when they had a celebration of the 30th year of his sold-out lecture series, how did he mark that occasion? Well, after the lecture, the curtain rose, and there was the Zamir chorale. And he then led the audience for 20 minutes in two Hasidic melodies, and it raised them to a sense of rapture. And when he first came to New York, and he came to our house for Shabbatim, and well, I'll never forget the ethereal quality of his Shabbat Zmirot. And I felt transported to another realm. Now, my closing story describes a scene at the 1971 General Assembly of the Federations. After his powerful debut the year before, there was a clamor to bring him back. I'm wise enough to know you don't try to repeat a success. So what we did instead, we had him speak at the Oneg Shabbat and basically do a reading of a work in progress. So he comes in there, very simple, table, chairs, and he opens up, comes in with his text, he looks up at the audience, he closes his eyes, and he starts singing a song in Yiddish. Wenn ich wollt gehabt Koyach, wollt ich gelaufen durch die Gassen, und ich wollt geschrien Shabbos, heilige Shabbos. If I had the strength, I would run through the streets, shouting the holiness of the Sabbath. People were stunned. He then opens up, does his reading, closes it, looks at the audience, closes his eyes, and sings it once again. So the point is that fortunately, Elie did have the strength to run through the streets of our consciousness, proclaiming the sanctity of life. And his call for moral action has made us more responsive, more caring, more compassionate, and thereby more human. And by making us more human, he enabled us to touch the divine. Did I knock you all out? This was not my original talk. I was going to speak on resilience, the mystique of Jewish survival. Maybe you'll have me back, I'll be happy. But given the fact that he just died, and when he died it was like the loss of a brother for me. I wrote this piece as part of my way of dealing with the loss. This became my way of mourning through. And he was so extraordinary. When you think about who's a moral figure in the world today, I mean, who do you look up to? Maybe, the Tibet, Dalai Lama. Who's a moral figure? To have somebody like this is just so rare. And my wife was a survivor, as I mentioned before, and a psychoanalyst. And she used to say to me, the biggest challenge that everyone faces is how they handle trauma. Because everybody has trauma in one form or another. And in her practice, she dealt with people who could not handle trauma. And she says, what's the advice we usually give them? Put it behind you and move on. And she said, there's something profounder to do, and that is to use the trauma and transmute it into creative energy and action. My wife did that twice, both becoming an artist and as a psychoanalyst. And look what Elie did out of his trauma. And this is a message I want you all to come away with. That you don't have to get stuck with a sense of victimization. You don't have to go under when you have trauma, but you want to use the trauma. And when I talk about, in my talk on resilience, if I do come back, I want you to know what my notion of, in that context of resilience, is not the ability when being knocked down to get up again. It's the ability when knocked down to bounce back higher than before, because you're using the trauma. questions? I mean, not exactly a speech that leads to questions, but who's going to be the first one? I mean, that's always the first breakthrough. Yeah.
I'm still processing these stories. First, condolences to you. I mean, I think the world feels a loss, but to have known this person and then you described him as your brother, I really can't imagine what it feels like to be without him, so.
Thank you.
As you're describing this person and talking about role models, that's something, you know, I think a lot of us worry about now. And I wonder, you know, what Elie might have said today, watching the discourse that we're watching unfold, that will hopefully end with something in November. I know that he's important to the Jewish community. I think he was also very important to the non-Jewish community. And I wonder if you have any insights on that, if he had any thoughts, if he had any opinions, if he was able to speak truth to power in Israel and in the States as well, beyond these presidents you spoke to. Was there anything current, or was he, you know?
Well, he always tried to rise above the political thing so that it wasn't associated with just one party. But I'm sure with what's going on now and with Trump, it would be devastating experience. Talk about confronting power with truth, you know. That's one point, but the second point I want to make is that I'm going to use my own language. My wife had died from Alzheimer's, and for many years I was part of an Alzheimer's group, and they asked me to write my experience, and I called it Countering Despair. And that, look, whatever the bad conditions today, how do they compare to him being in Auschwitz? And if he managed to come out of that and to create, I mean, that is to me the role model that we should take. So yes, he would feel terrible about what's happening, but at the same time, he would say, don't let yourself give up. We have to transcend and transmute into something more purposeful. I don't know if this answers your question. But
It's all interesting, it doesn't even matter.
okay.
Diane?
Along the lines of stories about Elie Wiesel, I was privileged to have him as my teacher at Boston University in the 1970s. And one of the things that was so impressive, among many things, was that he chose to stay with us, his class, and we were in a small class of about 30 people on the day of the Camp David Accord signing, when he had been invited to come to the White House and to be a part of that ceremony. And he made a very sort of impassioned conversation with us about how important it was for him to be with us at that time. And in those days, there were not, you know, it wasn't the digital world. He had a television brought into our classroom, and we watched together that signing. And then he, afterwards, flew to Washington and went later in the day for what were the celebrations of that moment. But, you know, as young people, to have someone of that stature say that we, his students, were important to him, and sharing that moment of history was important, was really just a tremendous tribute to who he was and how he felt about his role as teacher, and how he felt about students and engaging them. So I just wanted to share that.
I'm glad you raised that point, because it was an important aspect of his quality. He loved meeting students. And also his focus was never on answers, but always on questions. And that's why I framed my presentation as a series of questions, taking off, you know, from his approach to this thing itself. Yes, he loved dealing, because he saw students as the future. And that was concerned, how do you change the world? You've got to have the younger generation that has that objective.
Julie?
I'm just curious as to like how the passing of Elie Wiesel.
You speak a little louder, yeah.
Sorry, I'm curious how the passing of Elie Wiesel changes, I think, how we look at Judaism in the world today, because I feel like this happens at every Seder for some reason. There's usually this this rift between the people who think, we as Jews have to sympathize with the downtrodden and the persecuted, and that's our responsibility, or we're more responsible to protect ourselves because we're always in danger. It's us against the world. And I feel like Elie Wiesel navigated that really well, in terms of like his work in social justice, but then also being really strong. I remember when it came to Iran, nuclear war, and just as somebody who is descendant of Holocaust survivors on both sides, as that generation is fading away, how do you think that's going to shape, the ideology of world Jewry? And, what do you think, what kind of impact do you think we should have?
A very key and essential point. To what degree do we focus on Jewish particularism, and to what degree on universalism? On the Joint Distribution Committee, our primary responsibility is to meet Jewish needs, but we also have a non-sectarian program, and Sean could talk about that, where we service non-Jews who are in need as well. So I think this is a balancing act. My concern often is that somehow this tikkun olam, meeting others, often takes priority over the need to ensure Jewish continuity. So I think we have to give primacy to Jewish continuity, but we have to have room to understand that we're part of a larger world, and that we have a responsibility to heal and help heal them. Look, the whole idea of tikkun olam is theologically that God created the world not complete, and he left it up as mankind to complete that healing process. And this is a Jewish tradition, and that means both the healing for Jews, also healing for non-Jews as well.
Gabe?
I'm curious, if you were given an unlimited budget and unlimited resources in staff and volunteer time, how you might devote those to the relationship between American Jews and Israel, or at least American Jews' view on Israel, let's say, relationship and view. Would you? We have a lot of efforts going on currently. The highest profile is probably Birthright, I suppose, in the philanthropic community. But what might you add? What might you do differently if you had a lot of resources at your disposal?
I'm going to answer you, but start off indirectly. In 1968, I joined the Council of Jewish Federations as Director of International Affairs. As Director of International Affairs. When I came there, the organization was known as the Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds. Its focus was as a relief organization. Such things as Jewish education, etc., was really not part of their thing. And when I came there, they were having a conference called the Conference on Human Needs in Israel, which jokingly they took the letters, the Cohen Conference, Conference on Human Needs. In other words, the rationale for helping in Israel was because there were Jewish needs in Israel, and there were Jewish needs in other parts of the world. And I said, this is not enough, and when I left the council, the philosophy was, we are partners in nation building. So the question is, how do you perceive this? So we have to see that our relationship with Israel is an integral part, not only of our identity, but even of our I mean,
Even of our what? I didn't hear what you said.
it's an important component, not only of our identity, but also of our survival.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that Israel without a diaspora would be a small, isolated Mediterranean country. It's the global connection that makes Israel great. And at the same time, without an Israel, we'd be just kind of diffuse in small pockets of continuity here and there. So I think the big challenge, and it's not an easy question, is how do we make this partnership creative and two ways, and have Israel strengthen American Jewry and world Jewry strengthen Israel. I'll give you an example of world Jewry. I took a mission of Federation leaders from small Jewish communities, And we visited very Jewish communities, small Jewish communities around Europe. And we came to Oslo, and just at that time, the Soviet Union was hosting an international conference on gerontology, and they didn't have diplomatic relationship with Israel, and they refused to invite Israel to participate. At that time, there were 1,200 Jews in Finland, and these 1,200 got on the back of their class society, which got on the back of the, and the result was that Scandinavia en bloc said to the Soviet Union, unless you invite the Israelis in, we're not coming in either. And the mighty Soviet had to back down. So this is an example of the global reach, you know, of that's imperative to Israel. And at the same time, Israel. So like in all families, there are conflicts, there are differences, and everybody, and I think, you know, there's no simple answer. Let me put it this way. There's a saying that the manifestation of a first-rate mind is that they're able to contain contradictions. You're able to contain contradictions. And I'm trying to say, this is one where we're, I don't want to say contradictions, but we have different philosophies, different viewpoints, you know, but we have to find a way of dealing with it. It's a dynamic. It's not a simple answer. It will change from time to time. But I think we have to see this, that Israel has to be a major, major point for our concern for Soviet Jewry. And I'll have to tell you, you're dealing with this at the Ben-Gurion University all the time. And Doron and I were talking beforehand that way. Ben-Gurion University is not like most of the universities in the United States that have little to do with their surrounding population. And Ben-Gurion University sees that its function is the development of the human resources and the human condition in the Negev. So there's not just an intellectual achievement for saying. For example, when I grew up, philosophy was meant a way of examining one's life. Today, there's a whole school of philosophy that I don't understand. It's like abstract mathematics. It has nothing to do with how we live. And for me, as a Jewish communal worker, I mean, it's so removed. And therefore, I think that, again, I think we have to say we need both, and we have to find the best means of being able to relate both the continuity of American Jewry and the relationship with Israel, and see this as keeping us both parts alive.
Thank you.
Everybody exhausted? Yeah.
Dan?
I guess, I mean, you've been involved in this world for some time.
Just 70 years.
Only 7 years. Yeah, you know. But, and I'm sure you've seen all sorts of criticisms and, you know, vitriolic
Just
things.
one
Like,
second.
oh, sure, no problem.
Good colleague from way back.
Not 70 years exactly.
Right. Not
Touche.
quite. You know, I'm sure you've seen all sorts of developments in the conversation about Israel and just, you know, general. It can be a contentious conversation, unfortunately. And I feel like nowadays it's sort of at the point, it's almost like Democrat and Republican in America. You're with Israel or you're against Israel in a lot of ways, and sometimes if you bring it up, people can say, you know, all of a sudden it's just, oh, no, I'm not even gonna have that conversation, I'm against it, or no, I'm for it. And it can be difficult to have a nuanced conversation about it because the situation has become, you know, a bit tense over the years, and I'm wondering if you have any parallels to that you've seen. I'm sure you do, because you've been having this conversation for some time, and how do you start the conversation when, you know, people don't want to have the conversation? Does that make sense?
It makes sense that it doesn't make sense.
Fair enough.
Look, first of all, we have realized that part of the critique of Israel is from people who don't want Israel to exist altogether. So I think we have to recognize that. And I don't think there's any way of changing their minds. These are psychologically based things that are so profoundly rooted in there. They can't respond to an intellectual eye. So that group, I don't think anybody can do anything. But it's the other group, the middle ground that we're talking about between the totally anti-Israel and the totally Israel supporters, the big middle ground. I think what's important is to say, are we critiquing Israel out of love? Or are we critiquing Israel out of anger? Now, it's very easy to get angry. There are a lot of things that this Netanyahu does that just upsets me no end. But I'm not going to allow that to interfere with my love for Israel. In fact, I have a son living in Jerusalem as a clinical psychologist. I mean, that's not going to, so it's a big difference between, so when you engage these people, I think the point is, do you have any questions about the meaning and survival of the state of Israel for the Jewish people? And I remember in the DP camps in 47, 48, the notion, I was talking to Ron about it before, the notion of a Jewish state, I said, for many of the people, this created a whole new view of the Jew not as victim. And in 1948, when Israel was established, it was like overnight, the Jew condition, self-image, altered from victim to victor. And we have to keep that historic perspective for people. And that doesn't mean that either side is not gonna have faults that we're gonna disagree with. But we have to disagree with it from the point of view of, as I said, of love, of wanting the best, what's possible for both communities. So, it's a challenge, and, look, if you ask me, should be the common goal of all of us, and that is the creative continuity of the Jewish people. And that's done in a variety of ways, in a variety of places. And part of that relationship with Israel has to become part of the dialogue for achieving that objective.
Oh, no. Janice, Diane, we'll come back to you. Is that all right?
No,
Janice, please.
I just want to ask you where, where your parents from, and where were you born, and how did you get here? Because you told us about Elie, but I didn't hear about you.
Where's Ted Comet, you're asking?
Yes.
My parents came 100 years ago from, when they asked me what country were they born in, I'd say, what year are you talking about?
Right.
Because you kept switching from Russia to Lithuania to Poland, just at that key point. I was born and brought up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I came to New York to study at Yeshiva University. And from there, I went to France for 2 years. And that altered my life. That altered my life. I didn't intend to make Jewish communal work my career.
So
I
let me
expect to
ask
go
you,
to business like my siblings in Cleveland.
were your parents survivors?
Huh?
Were your parents survivors?
No, they came here 100 years ago.
Oh, that was okay.
Then
His
my-
wife,
yeah.
his wife.
Okay.
I was a late, with a child, I was the last one.
Okay.
I mean, my parents were already in their 40s before when I was born.
Okay.
So, there were two pieces I wanted to make about it. It was traumatic to come in. I didn't know much about the Holocaust. To come in and to see the destruction. And France, before the Marshall Plan, was a very inhospitable place, and the Jews weren't welcomed back. And to see the Jews coming back and searching for family, for friends, and then for jobs, for place to live, and there was the Joint Distribution Committee meeting those needs. And I said, wow, you can make a difference. And I felt with the reconstruction of the Holocaust in whatever small way I could. I wanted to try to fill that void in with my own potential. And the capacity of these children to respond to love and to concerned handling was impact. I said, my God, you can make a difference in people's lives. I said, what better way than have a career in that? So that's what, what I'm shaped by.
Okay.
So, is there more questions? Because I want to.
Diane had one more.
So much of your commitment, professional commitment, was born out of that experience of being in France and having an organization that was passionately committed to doing its work that you connected with. I think many of us in what is known as the Jewish communal field, you know, had those experiences, but it seems to me that some of that has changed in recent years from the time when I started in the field to where I am now, in looking at the young generation that's coming up. And I was just wondering, what does the field, from your perspective, need to do more of, do better, look forward to in terms of making sure that there are those kinds of opportunities for young people to be sort of proud Jewish communal workers, which is a phrase that I think you don't maybe hear quite as much. I just was wondering your thoughts on that.
Look, I want to say that the focus on the problematic side of Jewish continuity, getting the attention it merits, but at the same time, I think it obscures the successes we've had with the joint mission. They have entwined an outreach to the younger people, and this is a growing phenomenon because we find that young people inherently have an idealistic impulse.
That's right.
And to find ways of responding to that. Let me take this. When I went to the Council of Jewish Federation as Director of International Affairs, after a couple of years, they asked me to take on a second role, which is Director of Young Leadership Development, which didn't exist at that time as a structure. I took it over, I had no training, and I didn't have the slightest interest. And there was no, today, the courses are ubiquitous, there's more. There was nobody that could go to a local university, I was in nothing. I learned, one of the lessons that I picked up was this, that if you remove the outer layers that distinguish one person from another, you'll find that the inner core that we all share is a yearning for a sense of significance, for a hunger that somehow our lives have meaning and purpose. So the question is, how do you fill those needs? How do you respond to them? And one of the ways is to get connected to causes that are meaningful. And we have something, we have a 4,000-year-old history, no connect to this. And if we can get people excited about the drama of that 4,000 years, and that becomes our challenge, and that's the route to take. And that's why we're in the communities. So just to close, let me tell you the meaning that meeting you has for me. I'm 92 years old, and I worry. I was shaped by the Holocaust, the struggle for Israel, Soviet Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry. Are the young people today going to feel the passion and commitment that I had without that background? And when I come here and I see young people who are committed, who are engaged, it just makes me feel very pleased. There's a Talmudic saying that even more than the calf wants to be suckled by the cow wants to give milk to the calf. So I want you to know that whatever I have meaning to you, I want to tell you that you have meaning for me. I want to wish you well in your careers, and that you continue to play your important roles in achieving the creative continuity of the Jewish people. Thank you.
Wow. I want to begin by thanking everybody for their participation today. I can't let the moment pass without just adding a couple of quick comments at the tail end of this. We are all part of the continuity of history of family, the history of community, the history of the world, the history of our people. And we are profoundly impacted by the part that we see ourselves. We're very conscious of the fact that there's a lot of significant stuff that happened before us, but we are the beneficiaries of first-hand insight and observation and testimonial from those who came immediately before us. And on the major things in life, the things that really matter, we assume responsibility for the transmission of those things, and not to allow ourselves to get so caught up in the current moment that we lose track of the scope of the things that came before. Ted's talk today about the late Elie Wiesel. Those of us who came to know him when he was the conscience of the world didn't understand how he came into that role and how he so profoundly believed that that was not who he was supposed to be. He considered himself a pretty regular guy. Not a particularly extraordinary literary figure, not a particularly extraordinary leader, not a particularly extraordinary anything, but a guy who understood that he had specific responsibility and how to be able to draw the distinction between the uniqueness of the Jewish tragedy of the Holocaust and tragedy that befalls others, for which he was also a voice of great conscience as well. The past Chief Rabbi of Israel Meyer Lau, was one of those orphan children who survived the Holocaust, who may have crossed your path as well at that time, certainly crossed paths with Elie Wiesel, and in describing the experience of being a Jew in a concentration camp, being marked for death and distinguishing that between others who were in the camps who suffered terribly. He noted that it was the Jews who understood that every member of their family was probably lost and destroyed in the same context, and that there was no outsider who would survive and carry on, whereas victims who had come from other communities or backgrounds or were political prisoners, while they may have faced their personal doom, they didn't face the end of anything that might come from them. And I think that Elie Wiesel and Ted Comet and others who have come from that part of our story to this part of our story have understood that we have to make sure we don't lose track of distinction in the things that are going on in the world. We have to be sure we don't allow labels and nomenclature to be misused and therefore diminish the significance of the things for which those terminology was created in the first place. And we have to figure out how to answer the questions that were being asked at the end by Diane and by Dan. How do we contend with tough questions to make sure that we are transmitting in an instructive way, in an educational way, the things that people need to know if we are to carry forward on the missions of those who came before us. And that's the challenge. And I think maybe the thing that will stay with me as much as anything else, Ted, that you said was if we can figure out how to come to terms and manage through the contradictions and the disagreement and see that as part of what moving forward is all about and transmission is all about and the broad tent of community is all about, then we'll be successful. But we have a profound responsibility. So I want to express on behalf of this community and these folks and our very welcome guests my profound appreciation to you for sharing these reflections with us and giving us a little bit of your time, and maybe more significantly my thanks on our behalf for the contributions that you've made to all of the things that have been possible for us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I want to close with one thought. there's the story that when Solomon was building the temple, that he wanted to appoint a supervisor. And he thought he would do it among the workmen. And he went to the stonemasons, what are you doing? And they said, we're building the stonemasonry. And the wood carvers, the same thing. Everybody answered according to their specific task. And then he came to a sweeper along the street. He says, what are you doing? And he said, I'm building a temple. So I'm trying to tell you, whatever roles you have, and they vary, keep in mind that you're building a temple. Thank you.